We are continuing the portion that expresses God's indignation against His own people for following after every way but His own way. And this is by way of indictment of their actions. Hosea chapter 8, verse 1, "Set the trumpet to thy mouth. He shall come like an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and trespassed against my law. Israel shall cry unto me, My God, we know thee. Israel hath cast off the thing that is good, the enemy shall pursue him." What God is saying here is that when Israel calls, they'll not call to their God. One of the indictments has been, "Thou hast not called upon me." They'll not call until they know they're being completely overwhelmed by the enemy forces that will come upon them. Now, there's a difference of opinion as to whether or not verse 1 is speaking of the time when the Assyrians will come and take the northern 10 tribes captive, which happened during Hosea's ministry, whether it refers to that or whether it refers to the coming of Nebuchadnezzar 100 and some years later, leading the armies of Babylon against the Jerusalem and the very temple of God. And of course it's that last phrase that would seem to indicate, or that phrase that says, "an eagle against the house of the Lord." Babylon is described in these terms, and the house of the Lord would no doubt be in reference to the temple at Jerusalem, and of course it was Nebuchadnezzar who destroyed that temple, or his armies at least. This indictment is primarily against the northern tribes, but every now and then it will also include Judah, looking to that time on down. And it may very well be in reference to the coming of the Assyrians, and then have a little further view and have in mind the coming of the Babylonians. You'll notice in the last verse of this 8th chapter, verse 14, "For Israel has forgotten his Maker and builds temples," that means idol temples, "and Judah has multiplied fenced cities." So the condemnation is not just against the northern tribe, and so it may well be that our first verse here has primary reference to the later coming of the Babylonians. But whichever is the case, whether it's Israel crying, the northern tribes crying over the oppressiveness of Assyria, or whether to be the southern tribes crying out to God to protect them from the onslaught of the Babylonians, God will not respond to their cry. And he's giving this message to Hosea. In other words, he's given plenty of warning. He sent prophet after prophet, and he's predicting, the prophets are predicting, you're not going to hear until it's too late, until the floods of the enemy come upon you. Then you're going to cry out. Well, that's too late. You must come to me when I seek your presence, when I indict your sin, when I faithfully send my prophets to show your sin. And then if you will not repent, and you won't call upon God until you've got to have Him to save your necks, well, that's going to be too late. just like the rich man cried out from hell, but it's too late, wasn't it? The time comes when God will not always plead with man. The time will come when He will give fair warning. He never sends judgment unless He warns repeatedly of the judgment. But when the hearer just will not respond, then God must bring the judgment that He's promised. So the enemy shall pursue, even though Israel will cry out, "My God, we know thee." In other words, come help us. We can see now that we're about to get it in the neck, so to speak. And then God goes on in verse 4 with his indictment. They, that is Israel, have set up kings, but not by me. They've made princes, and I knew it not. That is, they didn't come to me for any advice whatsoever. Of their silver and their gold have they made idols for themselves, that they may be cut off. He says they're worshiping whatever they want to, and they're putting in leadership anybody they want to, and so why should I answer when they call? Verse 5, Thy calf, O Samaria, hath cast thee off. Mine anger is kindled against them. How long will it be before they attain to innocence? Now this calf, of course, was the golden calf that the first king of the northern tribes had set up. You'll remember the story that under the 40-year reign of King Saul, under the 40-year reign of King David, and under the 40-year reign of King Solomon, for 120 years, the kingdom, there was a united kingdom. All of the 12 tribes lived under the same control. But then, at the end of the reign of King Solomon, when his son Rehoboam came to the throne, the northern tribes refused to live under his rule because he promised them that he would be very oppressive. They complained, you'll remember, they complained to him because Solomon had exacted, they thought, too much from them. And his answer, through the advice of his counselors, was, if you thought that my father was oppressive, wait till you see what I'm going to do. And so they rebelled against him and set up a king named Jeroboam. There was Rehoboam in the southern kingdom, and there was Jeroboam in the northern kingdom. And, of course, the place of worship was in Jerusalem, which was the capital of the southern kingdom. And Jeroboam realized that the law required every male Israelite to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And he didn't want them to go down there and give their allegiance to the southern kingdom. And so he set up places of worship, 2 places of worship in the northern kingdom. He set up a golden calf at Bethel. And the reason, no doubt, that he chose that place is because it was revered as a holy place. That's where Jacob, their father, had his place of worship, or where he met God, named the God the El Bethel, the God of the house of God. And so they set up one calf there, and then they set up another one at Dan in the northern part of the kingdom. And the reasoning there was, I'm a good king, and I don't want you to have to go so far to worship, so I'll make it easy for you. And we'll put a place of worship much closer there. But when it speaks of the calf of Samaria, it was in Samaria where one of these idols were that they worshiped. And what God is saying is, look, you've been crying out to this golden calf all of these years. Well, why don't you get that calf to help you? That's who you've been worshiping. That's who you've been giving credits. You remember we studied before in the earlier chapters. God's indictment was this: I'm the one that gave you fertile fields and gave you protection from the enemy, and I gave you the rain, and you give all the credit to the idols. And you worship the God of productivity and all of that. You say, they're the ones that are doing this for us. So now, when you realize that they won't protect you, now you're coming to me for protection. Of course, he uses the imagery of a wife who would take sustenance from her own husband and take all of her living from her husband, but give all of her love to somebody else. And give her paramour, you might say, credit for her provision, when actually it was her husband that was giving it to her. And he has likened the situation between, God has likened the situation between him and his people to that. So verse 5 again, Thy calf, O Samaria, hath cast thee off. Mine anger is kindled against them. How long will it be before they attain to innocence? For from Israel was it also the workman made it, or from Israel. That is, this God you've been worshiping came from your own selves. Your workman made it, therefore it is not of God. It is not God. but the calf of Samaria shall be broken in pieces. You're going to see this that you've been worshiping as God is going to be destroyed at human hands, just like it was made from human hands. Verse 7, for they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. Now, this is a rather much quoted verse, even in secular circles. You can see this in print and news magazines and what have you. They sowed the wind and they reaped the whirlwind. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're doing something that you've got no business doing. You're doing something that should be in the domain of God. You should be seeking God's direction as how it should be done, and it's going to come and ruin you. For instance, a man shouldn't make wind. That's God's business. And if he gets involved in something that he shouldn't be doing, that's going to turn right around and destroy him. And this is what he means here. The whirlwind is a tornado or a hurricane. Both of those are whirlwinds within the definition of this. Both of them are what we would call cyclones. So if we do what God has not permitted us to do, and we go our own ways, well, that's the thing that will eventually become so big that it will destroy us. I suppose you could take a good example that would fit our modern day. If a person gets involved in drugs or any other body debilitating substance, pretty soon that'll do him in, won't it? And the person of his own will, he had no, let's just take drug addiction. There was nothing within his body that craved that. He just decided he wanted to try it. He did it willfully of his own will and injected that into his body. And pretty soon, that will control him. So he will sow the wind and he'll reap the whirlwind. And that's an example of what this saying means. And then he says, it hath made no stalk, the bud shall yield no meal. If so be it yield, the stranger shall swallow it up. In other words, you're not going to get any production. You might plant, but you're not going to get anything from it, because the whirlwind is going to see to it. And if that doesn't do it, the strangers will swallow it up. Verse 8, Israel is swallowed up. Now shall they be among the heathen or the nations like a vessel in which is no pleasure. The thought is this, that a vessel is something that's made for use. It's molded for use. Whether it be a clay vessel or whether it be a golden vessel, it has a use. And it's wanted for its use, not for itself. You don't go down and buy a dishpan for the sake of the dishpan, or whatever you have a container for. You only want it for the use it has. Well, Israel was brought to God. He brought Israel to himself because he had a use for Israel. And they gave themselves over to the use of someone else. And what he's saying is that you're going to find yourself as a vessel that nobody wants. I won't be able to use you for what I wanted you for. And you're going to find nobody wants you. And this is what Israel has found out as a nation for the past so many centuries. And it's true today. It's kind of a curse to be an ally with Israel today. And you can get all kind of trouble just trying to be friends with them. Because they're considered a vessel with no place, no use by all the nations of the world. What good are they? We'd be better off without them. Even the ones that aren't Arabs through the years have said we'd be better off without Israel. That's what Hitler said. That's what's been said down through the ages. That's what the Roman Empire said. They're of no use, so they're a clay vessel with no use. So break them. Do away with them. And this is a prediction of that Israel will be swallowed up. And they shall be among the nations like a vessel in which there is no pleasure. Now, of course, there's an application to us. And we'll see it further as we go along. Paul calls us earthen vessels. And we have within our beings a very precious commodity for this world. We are, though, in earthen vessels, the Apostle Paul says. Now, when we become saved, God has a use for us, and that's why we're vessels. We're really of no value on this earth except that we're usable to God. Now, if as far as our value here on earth, we might just as well be taken to glory as soon as we're saved. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, but Paul says, "But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us." He says, the vessels in which this treasure are, that these vessels, are of no value in themselves. In God's program, my body is no good except as a vessel to speak forth His truth. Now, if we won't be used for that, the world really has no use for us. We don't fit into the world's program very well after we're saved. We just don't fit. And so if we won't be used by God, then we're just out of pocket in this world. We're out of place. We're a vessel in which there's no pleasure. Even some of us that have a degree of recognition as doing our secular occupation in an acceptable manner, still, if you could hear some of the talk in the back circles, he'd do a lot better if he wasn't so religious. Or, if he didn't have his mind so much on all of this other thing, well, he could do his job better. We're a vessel without in which nobody gets any pleasure unless God is getting pleasure out of our being a vessel. I think that I want to stop right here. Now, we've done this, I think, at least 2 times in this Bible study, but I just feel impelled to do it one more time. And that is to go to these New Testament scriptures, which tells the scriptures that tell us why we're studying Hosea. And because I believe it's going to emphasize the lesson we'll get today. Let's go first to Romans chapter 15. Why are we studying? Why would we spend time to study Hosea? Why don't we study something in the epistles or something that's been written for us specifically? Well, what does the Apostle Paul say in the epistles? What do the epistles say concerning studying Hosea? What? Yeah. Well, let's look first in Romans 15, verse 4. For whatsoever things were written aforetimes. Now, Hosea is something that was written before time. When it says whatsoever was written aforetimes, the rest of the verse is going to define it as scriptures. What it means is what God wrote in the Old Testament. Whatsoever is written in the Old Testament we could read. Whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. They were written for our learning. It's interesting, as we go on down in this same chapter, the apostle quotes from all 4 of the sections of the Old Testament as we divide the Old Testament today. I'm not speaking particularly as how it was divided by the Jewish scholars of old, but we divide the Old Testament into Moses, or the Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books, and the books of history, which is generally, with maybe some difference of opinion, but generally described as those books that begin with Joshua and end with Esther. And then the books of poetry, which begin with Job and extend through Songs of Solomon. And somebody would place Lamentations in there also. And then the books of prophecy, which start with Isaiah and extend through Malachi. That's the four portions into which we divide the Old Testament, is it not? The Pentateuch, history, poetry, and prophets. Now, when the Apostle Paul says, whatsoever things were written aforetimes, now he is going to quote from each of these four sections that we've just delineated, and he's going to do that in four successive verses. And in each one of these passages that he's quote, what he's really doing is proving that God was sending the Messiah for both Jew and Gentile, and not just to the Jews. That God was doing something bigger on Calvary's cross than just calling Israel back to himself. Now let's look at those four verses. The first quotation is in verse 9, where it says, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written. And then here's a quote from 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 50. Now somebody will say, well, my Bible says, the margin in my Bible says it's from Psalm 18:49. Well, Psalm 18, the whole 18th Psalm, is the 22nd chapter of 2 Samuel. In other words, the psalmist took the 22nd chapter of 2 Samuel and incorporated it into the Psalms. Of course, at the direction of the Holy Spirit. But it's exactly the same. You can find that on your own time. But the quote is from 2 Samuel 22, verse 50. And then in verse 10, we have a quote from Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32:43. And again he saith, here it is, rejoice ye heathen, or ye nations, with his people. The nations are the Gentiles, the people are Israel. And in verse 11, a quote from the 117th Psalm. And again, praise the Lord, all ye nations, Gentiles, and laud him, all ye peoples. Here again, the people. Now, if you're wondering how we know that when he says peoples, he means the Israel, and when he says Gentiles, he means, when he says nations, heathen, or Gentiles, he means people other than Israel. If you want to know how we can be sure of that, well, that phraseology is used in the 2nd Psalm, and Peter does an exposition on the 2nd Psalm in Acts chapter 4, and he explains that that's what it means. So, I suggest you read Peter's sermon in Acts 4, and you can be sure that that's correct. But anyway, we have a quotation here from 2 Samuel 22, from Deuteronomy 32, from Psalm 117, and then in verse 12. And again, Isaiah says, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he that shall rise to reign over the nations, or Gentiles, in him shall the Gentiles trust. Now, he's quoting in verses 9, 10, 11, and 12. 4 verses. He's quoting from these 4 sections of the Old Testament, and in each quotation, what he's saying is that God in Christ was sending salvation to Israel and to all the earth. And he was saying that in the Old Testament. I think that's real interesting in view of verse 4 that says, whatsoever things. Wherever you find it in the Old Testament, in other words, it's written for our learning. And he proves it by quoting from every part of the Old Testament. He quoted first from the books of history, then the Pentateuch, then the poetry, and then the prophets in 4 successive verses. Now, stuff like that, when I find it in the Bible, to me it's just tremendously interesting because it ties the Bible together in such a way. Now, if I'm not wrong, I said almost the same words I just got through saying here a few nights ago, a few weeks ago. But anyway, I want to bring it to our attention at this time for a particular reason. Now, the very next book, 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. You'll remember that the first 10 verses of this 10th chapter recount some of the happenings of the children of Israel. And verse 11 says, now all of these things, now A-L-L, these things happened unto them. Unto who? Israel. Including those things that are described in the book of Hosea. All of these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition. Who is our? Who does that mean? Upon whom the ends of the world are come. That's us. They are written for us. They're written for our admonition. That's why we're studying Hosea. It gets studied precious little in the Christian community. But that's why we're doing it. One other scripture, 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 3. Let's look first at verse 15. And that from a child thou hast known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make thee wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. Now he's saying that Timothy has studied the Holy Scriptures. This means the Old Testament. Verse 16. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness. So, Hosea is part of the Scriptures. So Hosea is profitable for doctrine. It's profitable for reproof, it's profitable for correction, and it's profitable for instruction. Someone has made a little diagram of those words, and they put it this way: you're walking after you're saved. You're walking along a path. Doctrine in the Bible shows you the path to walk in. That's what Bible doctrine is. It's something to show you the path to walk in. You got to walk from the time you're saved until the time you go to be with the Lord by means of the grave or by means of the rapture. The Bible calls that our walk. Several times in the book of Ephesians, several times in the book of 1 John, our Christian walk is from that day that we're saved until we go to be with the Lord. And you have to walk a path. And doctrine shows you how to walk on that path. On the other hand, reproof shows you when you've gotten off of the path. You see, we don't always walk on the path. I haven't walked on the path of doctrine every moment since I was saved. Have you? I've gotten off the path. Well, we need reproof. That shows us that we're off of the path. Then, you see, correction tells us what we need to do to get back on the path after we've got off. Reproof shows you where you're off, how you got off, and in what way you're off. Correction tells you how to get back on. And then instruction shows you how to stay on the path. You see, it takes more than, because of the nature of what we are, it takes more than teaching. I think most anybody that in the teaching profession would say there is some difference between teaching and instruction. We might say teaching is getting the information across, whereas instruction would be guiding you into the utilization of that information, wouldn't it? You need to be instructed as well as to be taught. And if you have teaching only, you might get off the path. Somebody needs to show you where you got off. Somebody told you, well, here's where you get back on now. And now here is how you stay on that path. That's doctrine, reproof, correction, and instruction. Now, the New Testament says that Hosea is good for all of those things. Now, is that sufficient reason for studying it? Okay, we'll go back to Hosea. So we need to find out how to apply these things. Like this 8th verse. It's obvious that this is figurative language. When God says that Israel is like a vessel in which there's no pleasure, that's using figurative language. And nobody has to show us that. We know it, don't we? That it's figurative language. Well, we ought to be looking for the figure. Since it was written, it was written aforetimes. It was written for our learning, so that we might have patience and comfort of the Scriptures. It's written for our admonition. It's written for our doctrine, reproof, correction, and instruction. Then we ought to spend a little time trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to be like a vessel in which is no pleasure? Or in verse 9, for they are gone up to Assyria, a wild ass alone by himself, Ephraim hath hired lovers. Now what does it mean to go to Assyria like a wild ass alone by himself? Well, we've talked about this going to Assyria before. And the book of Hosea is full of it. And it's a book with a lot of figurative language. And it's obviously being used figuratively here. If you're saying somebody is like a wild ass going to Assyria, well, that's figurative language, isn't it? It has to be. So we should ask ourselves, well, what's the figure? Let's go back to chapter 5 again. Verse 10. No, not verse 10. How about verse 13? 5:13. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah saw his wound, see, it's tying both of them. Then went Ephraim to the Assyrian and sent to King Jareb, yet he could not heal you, nor cure you of your wound. He's saying you went to Assyria for a purpose, but it didn't do you any good. Assyria couldn't do what you needed to have done. All right? Let's look at chapter 7, verse 11. Ephraim also is like a silly dove. They call to Egypt. They go to Assyria. They're like a silly dove that goes to Assyria. They're like somebody with a wound that goes to Assyria. And they're like a wild ass that goes to Assyria. Well, pretty soon we ought to begin asking the question, well, what's this going to Syria mean? Well, let's look some more. How about chapter 8, verse 9, or chapter 8, verse 9 again? Well, we just read that. Chapter 10, verse 6. It shall be also carried unto Syria. This is this golden calf, because they're gonna take the calf and melt him down and use it for a bribe to Assyria, for a present to King Jareb. Ephraim shall receive shame for that. It won't do what they're going to try to get it to do. All right, chapter 12, verse 11. No, verse 1. Chapter 12, verse 1. Ephraim feedeth on the wind and follows after the east wind. He daily increases lies and desolations, and they do make a covenant with the Assyrians, and oil is carried into Egypt. Now, they keep going to Assyria and Egypt. Well, there's a literal explanation of that, of course, is because at this particular time, those two countries had more military might. than anybody else around. And so every time they would need some help, they would go to one of these countries and say, hey, help us. Well, they helped them, but not the way they wanted it. They were going to the wrong place. Well, what does it mean figuratively to go to Assyria and to go to Egypt? Well, we explained that about 2 weeks ago, but some of you weren't here. And I want to direct you to Jeremiah chapter 2. And we might do this 2 or 3 times, because we have to keep these same figures are in a little different ways are used over and over again. And if we not keep the figure in our mind, we're not going to understand what we're being told. Jeremiah chapter 2. In verse 13 of that chapter, remember, for my people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and hewed out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Verse 18, and now what hast thou to do in the way of Egypt to drink the waters of Shihor? That comes from a canal from the Nile River. And what hast thou to do in the way of Assyria to drink the waters of the river? That means the Euphrates. Well, what does it mean to drink the waters of the Nile and to drink the waters of the Euphrates? They go to Syria to drink the waters of the Euphrates. They go to Egypt to drink the waters of the Nile. Well, if you were to follow those 2 rivers all the way through the Bible, and you find out that figuratively the Nile River stands for the life that this world offers. See, water stands for life. Now, the Nile River is a muddy river, and it flows through Egypt, which is the world. And it stands for the life that this world offers. You know, like New Year's Eve party. It was amazing how many newspaper articles there were. I think 3 in the one paper I read on what to do about a hangover on New Year's Day. And the assumption was that all of us were going to end up with one. It's just one of those things, you know. And that's going. All of those people that ended up with a hangover on New Year's Day, they went and drank from the river Nile. Now that's what that means. And it'll fit all the way through the Bible. They're partaking of the life that this world has to offer. And to go to the Euphrates is to worship in some way other than God's prescribed way. Cain drank from the rivers of the Euphrates, so to speak, because he was willing to worship the true God, but only in his own way. And so when you figuratively go to Assyria or to Egypt, you're trying to get help from a source that won't help you. You're trying to find happiness in Egypt, or you're trying to find some type of spiritual stability in Assyria. I asked a missionary, what was the one thing, he comes on a furlough every 5th year. And I asked him to tell me some of the things that were different than 5 years ago when he came. And he says, well, the one thing I notice is the degree to which this country has gone after the occult. He says, you hear something about astrology on almost every TV program. And he says it's just full of witchcraft and demonology and everything imaginable that has to do, and all kind of weird ways to have some type of religious activity. And he says the way that people accept all of that is just another way to do your thing. It doesn't shock anybody that there's a church of Satan and all that type of thing, you know. It just seems to be something we've just channeled our thinking into. And This, of course, is going to Assyria figuratively. Now, Israel was doing it both ways. They were going literally and they were going figuratively. But you can always be sure in prophetic scriptures where you see a large amount of figurative language, which is obviously figurative, and if you see the same general figure being used over and over again, you better start looking deeper, because there's something more than just appears on the surface, or God wouldn't emphasize. He's saying, you know, this is about the 5th time I said this, you ought to start looking, because there's something there, you know, that I want to get across, and you're only going to get it. It's hidden. It's a treasure hidden. And you're only going to get it if you really want to know. For they are gone up to Assyria, a wild ass alone by himself. Now, when he says this, he's saying approximately the same thing that Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 10:23, when he says, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself, it is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. He's saying, if you try to run your own life, you're going to end up going to Assyria and going to Egypt, and you're going to do it with no more good reasoning than a wild ass. Now you stop and think about a wild ass. A wild ass is good for nothing in the world but to crop the forage very close, so that the sheep don't have enough to eat. And he can crop closer than a cow can, for instance. And an ass, you don't eat him, you don't milk him. You know, a cow, well, you can make shoes and tent out of his hide, and you can have milk to drink, meat to eat, train him to plow, most anything. Do all kind of things with a cow. But there's nothing you can do with an ass unless he's trained as a beast of burden. And of course, Israel was no good for God unless they'd be trained. Without training, they're not like a wild cow that you could shoot and kill, you know, and eat and have some good out of it. A wild ass is not good for anything. It's got to be trained to be good for anything. It's got to be taught how to take instruction. And when we won't believe, Jeremiah, when he says, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself, is not in man that walketh to direct his steps, then we're going around like a wild ass. And we're going to end up in Assyria drinking the waters of the Euphrates, or we're going to end up in Egypt drinking the waters of the Nile, just like Israel was doing. So it's another way of saying that they're a vessel in which there's no pleasure. A wild ass alone by himself, alone to his own devices, not worth anything to anybody, just a detriment. And I'm afraid that as far as God's programming in the world is concerned, most of the saved people eventually just turn in to a wild ass going to Assyria, and a vessel that's no good for anybody, the world or the Lord either. And we need to be admonished along those lines. You say, well, what's the answer to this observation on the part of the prophet Jeremiah? O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself, it is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. Well, the psalmist had the perfect answer for that. It's in Psalm 119. In Psalm 119, verse 133, first line. It's to cry out with my heart, order my steps in thy word. And it'll help some if we append to that the last part of verse 161 in Psalm 119, which says, my heart stands in awe of thy word. If we'll do this, if we'll recognize that the way of man is not in himself, and we'll let the word of God, if we'll let our heart stand in awe of his word, and ask him to order our steps in his word, then we can say with the psalmist in verse 105, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. In other words, we can't walk, the prophet says, but God has a way for us to walk, doesn't he? In my town, it calls it the New Testament Baptist Church. And I asked the fellow, says, why do you use that name? He says, well, we think that the Old Testament just mixed people up. He says, you want to stay in the New Testament. They sure do miss a lot of goodies, don't they? I guess we better get back to Hosea. I was teaching in a young adult class for a few weeks, and there was a young married lady, I suppose, maybe in her late 20s. She'd been there in the class that day, and I came up to the foyer of the church about the same time she did, and her mother was walking out. She'd been in another class. The mother asked the daughter what she'd heard about in Sunday school. And she says, well, Mr. Kelso has been teaching us Hebrews from Deuteronomy. So I guess we better get back to Hosea, or somebody's going to accuse me of teaching Hosea from somewhere else. But that's what she said. Verse 10, yea, though they have hired among the nations, now will I gather them, and they shall sorrow a little for the burden of the king of princes. Now, that verse is a little obscure, but what it means is that they're going to go somewhere else. They're going to try to get their help from somewhere else. But I'm going to gather them together where I want them, and they're going to find themselves for a while under the burden of the king of princes, and this might very well refer to Nebuchadnezzar. Certainly it refers to Assyria and the king of Assyria, but it might also apply to Babylon. Verse 11, because Ephraim hath made many altars to sin, altars shall be unto him to sin. In other words, if he wants to go into idolatry, he's going to live in an idolatrous nation. That's the only kind of worship he can have. That's what he wants. I have written to him the great things of my law, but they were counted as a strange thing. The Apostle Paul says that Israel had an advantage. We find that in Romans chapter 9. In Romans 9, verse 4, who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth, and then he's going to name 4 things that the Israelites had that no other nation had in their time. They had the adoption, they were adopted into the family of God, and the glory, and the covenants. I suppose when it says the glory, it means the Shekinah presence in the tabernacle. The covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, the promises, whose are the fathers. That means the spiritual fathers were their fathers, and of whom, as concerning the flesh, Christ came. This is 4 advantages they had. Well, privilege always begets responsibility. That's why you have all of this book of Hosea, together with a large part of Jeremiah, and and a large part of Isaiah. The people on the tape might be wondering why I'm hesitating a little. I have a problem. Sometimes I get hay fever, and if I have a very effective cure for that. But, I mean, it takes care of it, but it also makes me sleepy. And I have to decide which is best, to try to teach the Bible with something trickling down my throat, or whether to try to teach the Bible with my eyelids droopy. And so I chose this way this time. And so if you saw me up here sleepy one other time, I don't always have this problem. It just comes on 2 or 3 times a year, and I have to fight it one way or the other. But I chose to fight it this way this time. So we'll do the best we can. At least I'm not sleepy tonight. So he says in verse 12 again, I have written to him the great things of my law, and they were counted as a strange thing. These 8 advantages that we read about in Romans 9, they didn't take them as privileges, and this is the problem. And if Paul says that the nation of Israel was that blessed and that privileged, then how much more we are privileged? How much more privilege do we have? And remember, privilege begets responsibility. So we must not take our privilege lightly. We must not take the great things of grace and count them as a strange thing. Verse 13. They sacrifice flesh for the sacrifice of mine offerings, and eat it, but the Lord accepteth them not. Now will he remember their iniquity, and judge their sins. They shall return to Egypt, both figuratively and literally. Now you say, where in the Bible did they return to Egypt? Why does it say return to Egypt? Well, look at chapter 11, verse 1. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. And he says they're going to return to Egypt. And I, no doubt, he's referring to the time when a great share of the remnant, or I better not use the word remnant because it's used in a different context, a great share of the remaining people when in Judah, when Babylon came and took captive the best, many of the others went down into Egypt for refuge. And there were among those a great number who had escaped out of Israel, or the families of whom had escaped out of Israel. And no doubt, from a literal standpoint, this is what it's speaking of. You see, sometimes when figurative language is used in the Bible, it only is speaking figuratively. For instance, when it says, Ephraim is a wild ass, well, that's strictly figurative, isn't it? But when it says Israel went to Assyria, it's literal. But you must not conclude absolutely that it is not also figurative. In other words, much of the language in the Bible that's figurative is strictly figurative. Like, swallowing a camel and straining it in a gnat. The other way around, isn't it? Yeah, no, that's it. Straining a gnat and swallowing a camel. But there is some literal language in the Bible, much, not just some, but much literal language in the Bible that has a figurative meaning, and that is not spiritualizing. I was showing someone how you could track your Christian growth by using the 7 days in Genesis 1. And they said, well, that sounds great, but aren't you spiritualizing? Now, you see, spiritualizing a scripture, like spiritualizing Genesis 1, would be to say, God only wrote it that way to teach a spiritual lesson. He didn't mean for us to take it literally. He's using figurative language, and it doesn't mean that he created in 7 days and that he did this on such and such a day. It means something spiritual, and we should look for the spiritual content, and we shouldn't worry about what it says literally because it doesn't mean that literally. Well, that's spiritualizing the Bible. But applying a figurative meaning is something entirely different. That's to say, that story in Genesis 1 is literal. It means exactly what it says. And that's literally the way it was done. And when God says that Eve was made in this manner, that's literally how Eve was made. But he made Eve that way. By the way, I'm not under the impression that the story of the making of Eve is in Genesis 1. That's in Genesis 2. So I skipped chapters on you, and somebody might get that wrong. Anyway, I skipped from Genesis 1. I'm in Genesis 2 now, okay? In Genesis 2, you have the story of how Eve came about. Now, that's literally the way she came about. But God brought her into being in that particular manner to teach a figurative lesson, a spiritual lesson, and we can know that because Paul explains it as such in several places, and most pointedly in Ephesians chapter 5. That God did it that particular way. He had a particular purpose when he utilized a portion of the body of Adam in order to make Eve. He could have done it anyway. He did it that way, but he did it for spiritual reasons. And we should seek a spiritual truth there. The Bible permits us to do that. In fact, it instructs us to do that. But that is not spiritualizing. Now, if I say, as I've heard it said, listen, the Bible is not saying that that's how Eve came about, or that how woman first started. That's a story to tell a spiritual lesson. And you're going to get all mixed up if you think that ever happened literally. Now that's spiritualizing. Spiritualizing is discounting the literalness and using a spiritual application. And I trust I'm never guilty of that. If you think I am at any time, please point it out. Because I don't highly regard all of the people that I consider to spiritualize the Scriptures. In fact, I've met a lot of them. I've never met one who I want to emulate in any way. Because any of them I've talked to, I haven't been able to detect for sure at all that they were saved. So if you ever think I'm spiritualizing the Scriptures, please be the first to speak up, because I don't want to be classified among that ilk. Back in Hosea, verse 13. They sacrifice flesh for their sacrifice and mine offerings and eat it, but the Lord accepteth it not, because they're doing it out of formality, that is. Now will he remember their iniquity, and judge us, then they shall return to Egypt. Figuratively, and to an extent literally. For Israel hath forgotten his Maker, and builds temples, and Judah hath multiplied fenced cities. But I will send a fire upon his cities, and I shall devour their palaces. Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy, like other people, for thou hast played the harlot, or, as your translation probably said, is gone a-whoring from thy God. Thou hast loved reward upon every corn floor or threshing floor. Now, the reason I read the first verse of chapter 9 is because in many of your Bibles there's a title to that which would indicate a separate division of thought. And I suppose that's all right. But you're really only going to understand chapter 9 if you'll tie it in very closely to chapter 8. when it's talking about rejoice not, O Israel, for joy like other people. It's talking about the same thing as a vessel in which there is no pleasure among the nations. And you got the same lesson here as far as a Christian is concerned. There is no joy for a Christian, even the kind of joy that an unsaved person has. If you're a child of God and you stray from His direction, if you're like the Israelites were, all we like sheep have gone astray. What I'm saying is, if you really are a saved person and you're trying to have a good time at the New Year's Eve party, you got a rough job. Because you may try to get yourself to believe you're having a big time. I mean, when I say a New Year's Eve party, I trust you get the connotation. Some of those people are having as good a time as they ever have. They are. But if you're a real child of God, they're going to have a lot better time there than you are, even if they get a hangover and you don't. Because you just can't joy in what they joy in. So you see, that was the position God's people were here. They'd gone from their God, and they were trying to act like the nations around. They said, we want a king like all the nations around us have. We want to be like them. And there's no way they could be happy being like the nations. And there's no way a saved person can be happy trying to find their joy in the same place the world finds it. No way. And that's our application. And so I wanted to tie that first verse in to let you know we're just continuing on in the same general subject matter. Shall we pray? Father, we thank you again for every part of your word. We see your hand in this book of Hosea, just like we see your hand in the book of Romans. And we thank you that you can show us within our own hearts, that you speak to us today from your scriptures, wherever we might find them. And we rejoice in this. In Jesus' name, amen.